In 1919, two brothers from a small Michigan foundry town owned the second biggest automobile company in America, 17,000 employees, and one of the largest personal fortunes in the country. Within 11 months, both of them were dead. Within 20 years, one grandson would drown on his honeymoon after a dynamite accident. One granddaughter would drink herself to death by 43. Another heir would die alone in a police station under circumstances the family never let anyone investigate. And decades later, a former showgirl who married into the family would stand in a Manhattan courtroom and plead guilty to grand larceny, having gone, as one newspaper put it, from riches to rags. This is the real story of the Dodge brothers, the men who beat Henry Ford in one of the most important lawsuits in American business history, built an empire on precision machining and pure stubbornness, and then watched almost everyone who inherited their name lose it in spectacular fashion. Two brothers built something that should have lasted a century. It barely survived one generation. John Francis Dodge was born in 1864 in Niles, Michigan, a small industrial town near the Indiana border. His younger brother, Horace Elgin Dodge, followed 4 years later. Their father ran a modest machine shop, and the two boys grew up learning the trade side by side: lathes, forging, the exacting hand skill of fitting metal to metal, where there's no shortcut that doesn't eventually get discovered. The brothers were, by every account from people who knew them, functionally inseparable. They worked together their entire lives, made every major decision jointly, and according to Detroit society observers of the era, their own wives had learned to be jealous of the bond between them. John was the outward-facing one, sales-minded, quick-tempered, built like a boxer, with a temper that showed up in the newspapers about as often as his balance sheet did. Horace was quieter, more mechanically gifted, the one who actually invented things, including an early dirt-proof ball bearing that helped fund their first real business venture. Neither man, by any surviving account, ever really functioned without the other close by. Both men also drank hard, in a pattern one later historian described as binge drinking, months of relentless work punctuated by nights of genuinely spectacular public disorder. Detroit newspapers of the era recorded more than one of these nights in detail: a lawyer beaten with his own cane after a dispute, a bartender forced to dance atop his own bar after a Dodge sales convention, a newspaper publisher confronted at his own front door over an unflattering article. The fortune grew every year. Respectability, for a long time, did not follow it. They moved through a series of machine shops in Detroit and across the river in Windsor, Ontario, and by 1900 had saved enough from a brief, profitable stint in the bicycle business to open their own machine shop in Detroit. It was small and unremarkable. Two brothers in their mid-30s finally working for themselves after over a decade in other men's shops. In 1903, the Dodge brothers made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. A Detroit mechanic named Henry Ford, who had already failed twice at starting an automobile company, was trying a third time. The Dodgers agreed to build the entire chassis for Ford's new company, the running gear for what would become the Model A, on terms that tied their shop's future almost entirely to a man with a losing track record. Ford, chronically short on cash, couldn't fully pay what he owed for parts already delivered. In place of roughly $10,000 in unpaid bills and extended credit, the Dodgers accepted 10% ownership of Ford Motor Company instead. It looked at the time like a consolation prize. It turned out to be one of the greatest investments in American industrial history. For the next decade, the Dodge brothers built essentially every Ford, while Ford grew from a speculative gamble into the most successful car company on earth. Dividends rolled in. But by 1913, the brothers had decided they were done being someone else's supplier. They cut the Ford contract, and in 1914, Dodge Brothers Motor Car Company launched its own automobile. A car that was, by nearly every engineering measure, genuinely better than the Model T. John Dodge summed up the bet in a line that would prove exactly right. "Someday," he said, "people who own a Ford are going to want an automobile." By 1916, Dodge had climbed to second place in American car sales, trailing only Ford itself. Henry Ford, watching his former suppliers become his most serious competitor, decided to fight back, not with a better car, but with money. In 1916, sitting on a massive cash surplus, Ford announced he would stop paying special dividends to shareholders entirely, redirecting all of it into expanding his factory operations instead. His public reasoning was about growing the business and paying workers well. His private motive, understood by everyone paying attention, was to starve the Dodge brothers of the Ford dividend income they'd been using to fund their own competing company. The Dodges sued. The case, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, went to the Michigan Supreme Court, which ruled in February 1919 that Ford was legally obligated to prioritize shareholder profit over his own broader ambitions. The court's opinion contained a line that's still taught in business schools and law schools a century later. A corporation exists primarily for the profit of its stockholders. Ford was ordered to pay out a massive dividend, and in response, in a fit of pure spite, raised $75 million from a banking syndicate and simply bought out every other shareholder in the company, the Dodge brothers included, for $25 million combined. Between that buyout and over a decade of dividends, the Dodges turned an initial investment of essentially nothing into roughly $34 million, worth close to $1 billion in today's money. They were now, by any measure, among the wealthiest men in America. They were also, at the exact same moment, still socially unwelcome in Detroit's oldest country clubs, which had rejected both brothers' membership applications. John's response was pure defiance. He built a mansion directly across the street from one of the clubs that had snubbed him. In January 1920, both brothers traveled to New York for the National Automobile Show, where they hosted a dinner for 200 of their car salesmen at the Ritz-Carlton. Within 2 days, both men were seriously ill. The diagnosis was influenza, the tail end of the same pandemic that had already killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and hadn't finished yet. John Francis Dodge died in his hotel suite on January the 14th, 1920. He was 55. Rumors started almost immediately that Ford had somehow arranged to poison his former partners, or that they'd been drinking tainted liquor during the earliest days of Prohibition, which had begun just 2 days before John's death. Neither theory held up. The brothers had simply attended a crowded dinner in the middle of one of the deadliest pandemics in American history, and John's lungs, already weakened by an earlier bout of tuberculosis, couldn't fight off the secondary infection. Horace never recovered from the loss. He'd written, in the days after his brother's death, that their lives had been so inseparable since childhood that he could barely imagine the years ahead without him. He was right to worry. His drinking, already heavy for years, accelerated sharply. He stopped visiting the factory. Official reports at the time attributed his declining health to lingering effects of the flu. Medical records later on would point to cirrhosis of the liver instead. Horace Elgin Dodge died in Palm Beach on December the 10th, 1920, 11 months and 4 days after his brother. He was 52. Both men were laid to rest in an Egyptian revival mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, flanked by 2 Sphinx statues the brothers had commissioned years earlier when they'd assumed there would be plenty of time left to enjoy the fortune they'd built. There wasn't. And what came next would prove far messier than either brother could have imagined. The company the brothers left behind was run entirely on their joint instinct, a partnership no succession plan had ever accounted for. Control of Dodge Brothers Motor Car Company passed to their widows, Matilda Dodge, John's third wife, a former secretary 20 years his junior, and Anna Dodge, Horace's wife, a former piano teacher from Scotland. Neither woman had any experience running an industrial company, and neither particularly wanted to. Under hired management, Dodge's market position slowly eroded, falling from second place in American sales to well outside the top 10 within a few years. In 1925, the widows sold the company to a New York banking firm for $146 million, the largest cash transaction in American history at the time. 3 years later, it passed again, to Walter Chrysler, who folded it permanently into what would become the Chrysler Corporation. The Dodge name would go on to outlive the family that built it by the better part of a century, eventually ending up under a multinational conglomerate headquartered in Amsterdam. What the widows did with their share of that fortune, though, is where this story gets genuinely strange. Both women spent the following years converting raw industrial wealth into old-world grandeur. Matilda, remarried to a Detroit lumber baron, built Meadowbrook Hall outside Rochester, Michigan, an 88,000-square-foot Tudor Revival mansion with over 100 rooms, funded in part by repurposed materials from an unfinished house she'd been building with John before he died. Anna, remarried to a much younger former Broadway actor, tore down her existing mansion and replaced it with an equally enormous French classical estate, filled with tens of millions of dollars in art and antiques hand-picked by one of the era's most famous art dealers, including a 5-strand pearl necklace, purchased from Cartier for the equivalent of nearly $1 million, rumored, possibly accurately, to have once belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia. Both women, in effect, completed the social rise their husbands had never quite managed while alive. Detroit society, which had once rejected the Dodge brothers outright, found it couldn't reject the Dodge widows in the same way. The fortune had simply grown too large, and the widows too careful, to be dismissed the way the brothers once had been. Anna, in particular, made one decision in the late 1920s that would define the rest of her long life. On the advice of her art dealer, she moved a substantial share of her fortune into government bonds well before 1929. When the stock market collapsed that October, wiping out roughly 90% of American stock values within a few years, Anna's fortune came through almost entirely intact. A piece of financial foresight that neither of the Dodge brothers nor most of their heirs would ever manage to replicate. But while the widows were building palaces and quietly protecting their fortunes, the next generation of the family was already coming apart. John Dodge had 6 children across 3 marriages, and one of them, John Duval Dodge, became the family's first real cautionary tale. His mother died when he was young. His father quietly remarried and divorced a second wife in a union so secret that John Duval's own siblings didn't learn about it for over 70 years. When John Duval grew up and married a Catholic woman against his father's wishes in a strictly Presbyterian household, his father's response was brutal and precise. His will cut John Duval down to $150 a month, out of an estate worth roughly $50 million. Not a punishment so much as a formal, legally binding announcement that he was no longer considered part of the family. John Duval spent the rest of his life fighting it in court, winning a modest settlement in 1921 and losing a much larger challenge in 1939 when the Michigan Supreme Court upheld the will entirely. He drank heavily, litigated constantly, and in 1942, after what contemporary reports described only as a night of heavy drinking, fell into a coma at a Detroit police station and died at 44. Whether the fall alone explained what happened to him was a question his own family chose never to pursue publicly. No investigation followed. The heir Matilda actually hoped would carry the Dodge name forward was her son, Daniel George Dodge, mechanically gifted like his uncle Horace, disciplined and by every account the most promising of the family's second generation. In 1938, against his mother's strong objections, he married a young woman named Laureen MacDonald, the daughter of a Canadian tugboat captain, and the couple left for a honeymoon at the family's lodge on Manitoulin Island in Ontario. 13 days in, Daniel and a caretaker were experimenting with dynamite left over from clearing tree stumps on the property. 2 explosions went off. Daniel's skull was fractured and his arm badly injured. In a desperate scramble to reach the hospital by speedboat across rough water, Daniel, weakened and disoriented, went overboard partway across and never resurfaced. His body wasn't recovered for 23 days, found eventually by local fishermen half a mile from where he'd gone into the water. Rumors followed immediately that Laureen had pushed him overboard for the inheritance, that the dynamite explosion hadn't been an accident at all. The coroner's official ruling was accidental drowning, and the only surviving eyewitness account, recorded decades later, described Daniel simply panicking in the water and jumping rather than being pushed. A bitter inheritance battle followed regardless, with Laureen eventually winning a substantial settlement from the family. Matilda's chosen heir, the son she'd expected to carry the Dodge name into the next generation, was buried at Woodlawn beside his father and uncle 13 days after his own wedding. On the other side of the family, Horace's children took the fortune in an entirely different direction. His daughter, Delphine Dodge, Glamorous, widely photographed, the first woman to win a major national powerboat racing trophy, moved through a string of high-profile marriages and very public scandals, including a tabloid-covered romance with an Irish boxer. In 1943, she died in New York at just 43, her death attributed by contemporary reporters directly to the effects of severe alcoholism. Her brother, Horace Elgin Dodge Jr., managed to make her story look restrained by comparison. Married 5 times, he burned through settlement after settlement, borrowed well over $1 million from his own mother just to keep his final marriage afloat, and eventually filed for divorce from his 5th wife, with a blunt explanation to reporters: he simply couldn't afford her anymore. He died in 1963 at 63, with claims against his estate totaling over $12 million against actual assets of well under $1 million. A fortune that had, in the span of one lifetime, essentially evaporated. That 5th wife, a former showgirl who performed under the stage name Greg Sherwood, became a case study in her own right. Before Horace Jr. ever proposed, he'd had her picked up by police over a minor dispute involving some missing cigarette lighters, and then married her anyway. After his death left her nothing in his will, she sued his elderly mother directly and walked away with a settlement reportedly worth close to $20 million. She spent it, by most contemporary accounts, as fast as it arrived. Failed business ventures on multiple continents, extravagant purchases documented in a string of lawsuits from jewelers and department stores, a second husband who died by suicide amid their mounting financial collapse. By the late 1970s, she and her family had filed for bankruptcy, listing millions in debt against a few $100s in cash on hand. In 1979, she pleaded guilty to grand larceny in a Manhattan courtroom, avoiding prison only because her own son personally appealed to the judge on her behalf. She died in 2011 in a small apartment in Florida, and the local paper that had once covered her rise ran her obituary under a single blunt headline: "From riches to rags." Anna Dodge outlived nearly everyone. Her husband by 50 years, her daughter by 27, her son by 7, dying in 1970 at 103 years old. Her final years were reportedly modest ones. Hymns with her minister, an old television set, records playing in the same turquoise-walled bedroom where she'd spent decades. In her will, she deliberately cut out 2 granddaughters who had already spent and borrowed through most of their expected inheritance while she was still alive, and left $2 million toward a public memorial for her late husband and son, an abstract stainless steel fountain that still stands on Detroit's riverfront today, containing no likeness of either man at all. Matilda, meanwhile, took a different path entirely. She and her second husband donated their 88-room mansion and its surrounding land to Michigan State University, a gift that eventually became Oakland University, still operating today. Her share of the fortune, in the end, built a campus. Anna's built a fountain with no faces on it. Between them, the 2 widows had converted an industrial fortune built on precision machining into monuments neither brother could have pictured when they were running a small machine shop above a fish shop's rent payment in 1900. The company itself outlasted every single one of them. Dodge passed from the widows to a New York banking firm, to Chrysler, and eventually into a series of multinational mergers that left the brand: Challengers, Chargers, Ram trucks, sitting on American dealership lots under corporate ownership, headquartered an ocean away, with no member of the Dodge family holding any role in the business at all after 1925. And the yacht Horace commissioned but never lived to see launched, the SS Delphine, somehow survived everything else. Requisitioned by the U.S. Navy during the Second World War, it carried C, near American military officers, as part of the operation that secretly moved President Roosevelt to the Tehran Conference. Restored decades later at a cost of tens of millions of dollars, it remains remarkably one of the last operating steam-powered superyachts in the world, a piece of the Dodge fortune still afloat, long after almost everything else the family built had been sold, demolished, or simply spent. 2 brothers built an empire out of precision machining, stubbornness, and a lawsuit that changed American corporate law forever. They didn't live to see their 50th wedding anniversaries, let alone their 80th birthdays. And the family they left behind spent the following half-century proving over and over just how quickly a fortune that size can come apart. That's the real story behind Two Brothers, a landmark lawsuit and a family fortune that scattered faster than almost anyone could have predicted. If you're new here, this is Brand Ancestry. Every video, we dig into the hidden history behind the everyday things nobody thinks to question. If that's the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy, subscribe and stick around. And I want to know, out of everything in this story, the Ford lawsuit, the 11 months between the brothers' deaths, or the honeymoon that ended in the water, which part surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next one.